Hi, it's Daniel Pre here. Today we're going to be looking at opening principles for beginners. And if you are a beginner and you know that you should study openings, it's important that you understand that that does not mean that you'll have to memorize endless variations, remembering move by move exactly what to do against anything your opponent might possibly throw at you. Nothing like that. That's not what studying opening means if you're a beginner. If you're a beginner, you want to understand what the opening principles are, meaning what you should do, what you shouldn't do when you are starting a chess game. So let's cover that in detail, starting from the assumption that you're playing with the white pieces. Very similar principles will apply if you're playing with the black pieces as well. So first of all, as you will notice, you start in the game with the king in the center. Now the king is the most vulnerable piece because it's pretty much the only way to lose a game. If you get checkmated, you're losing a game. Even if you're not getting checkmated but your king is in check, you gotta stop whatever you're doing in other areas of the board and you have to attend to that. You have to make sure your king is no longer in check, otherwise once again, it's illegal or you lose the game. So the first thing you want to consider is how do I make sure that I bring my king to safety as soon as possible? While at the same time, I need also to control as many central squares as possible. So in general, we refer to the center as these four central squares over here. Sometimes we talk about the extended center. So we include these squares over here, potentially all the squares here as well. But once again, the four central squares are the most important ones. And that's true pretty much in most games that have a board. So if you think about very simple games like tic-tac-toe, for example, there's one central square and that square is the most important square. And again, in other games, you may argue that that's the same. And the point is, central squares are the squares that are connected to the most other squares as well. But at the same time, if you imagine putting a piece on a central square, let's say you want to bring a knight to a central square, or you bring a bishop or a queen, or even a rook, or even your king, if it's safe to do so, that's where your pieces control the largest number of other squares. So the center is very, very important. Now, in order to do that, what you want to do is to find the quickest way to control as many central squares as possible while making sure your king is safe. So this is the main goal of the open. Now, in general, the goal of the opening is to get a playable middle game, ideally a middle game where, if you're white, you have some chances to push for a win. If you're black, you are not worse. That is the idea. But especially as a beginner, you shouldn't worry too much about being white or black. It's more about really making sure that your pawns and your pieces are on the optimal squares in order to generate more chances to get an attack, chances to get some tactics working in your favor, and also reducing the chances for your opponent to get the same. So immediately you want to see, okay, if I want to castle as soon as possible, how many moves does it take? It takes 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 moves minimum to castle kingside. And it takes, say for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 moves minimum to castle on the queen side. Now what's important to notice as well is that castling queenside only brings your queen to c1, not to b1. So if you want to stay extra safe, usually you'll spend one more tempo to bring the king to b1. So you could assume that it's actually 6 moves rather than 5. This means that more often than not, you will castle kingside. If you're a beginner, I suggest that you stick with castling kingside for the time being until you understand the game a little bit better and understand when you actually want to castle to the other side of the board. So for now, just focus on castling kingside as soon as possible, which means you either want to start with e4 or d4, but if you start with e4, you're going to be a little bit faster. But then you have to worry about this e4 pawn because it's actually an unprotected pawn that you have in the middle of the board. If you start with d4, you need one more move to castle kingside, but you don't have to worry about the pawn on d4 because it's actually harder for your opponent to attack it because it's currently protected and it's easy to support the pawn as well. So both options are good, and if you're interested in deciding if you want to start the game with e4 or d4, I suggest you watch my video 1e4 or 1d4, because we go a lot more deeply into this particular subject. Right now we'll focus on general opening principles. So castle your king as soon as possible, it's one, and control central squares. Now there's two ways to control central squares. You can control central squares by occupying the center. So for example, move like e4, controlling these two squares, a move like d4, once again controlling more squares in the center of the board. And that's one way to do that. But the other way to do that is to control the center from distance. So for example, g3, bishop g2, you are controlling the center without occupying that. If you're a beginner, I suggest that you leave this for later. So there's nothing wrong with that. However, if you don't understand the dynamics of controlling the center by occupying it, I think you will struggle to understand how to control the center from distance. As a matter of fact, you'll probably just be crushed. So my suggestion is that once you understand how to occupy the center and control it, then you can start learning how to control it from distance. That is my suggestion. So the next thing you want to do, therefore, is to combine these two ideas. How can I castle as quickly as possible and occupy the center? So once again, e4 makes a lot of sense here. So let's say you want to start a game with e4. And what you're doing really, you say, hey, this bishop all of a sudden has got somewhere to go to. This queen can move as well, which is nice. This knight can move. This knight could have moved one move earlier as well. Nothing wrong with that. And then I can castle. So that's great. And let's say black continues with e5, for example. Of course, there's other options, but just want to prove some points here. And now you're controlling these squares. Black is controlling those. What you want to do is develop quickly. So if you can develop in a way that creates a threat, that's generally preferable. So knight f3 is a move you want to make anyway, and you also attack in this pawn. So black will have to do something about that. Now, I've been developing the knight before the bishop. That's another opening principle. When I say opening principles, by the way, I'm not talking about universal truths that have to be followed no matter what. As a matter of fact, when I talk about a chess principle, it's something that usually will have to be followed maybe 65, 70% of the times, which is not a lot. It's really not a lot. So the reason is there's really a lot of situations where you can go against the principle if there is a specific reason to do that. But again, if you're a beginner, it's not very easy to understand when the case is. And therefore, I suggest you stick to the principles, and as soon as you master them, then you will learn how to break them successfully. So it's something that happens later, and that's true in every craft, really. If you are an art student, if you're a painter, if you like drawing, you want to learn first how to do things following the principle, and then you can break all the principles and be true artists once you truly understand them. So let's focus on this other principle now, which is develop knights before the bishops. Why is it so important to develop your knights before the bishop? The reason is it's pretty obvious where these knights are going to go. So you have a knight on g1. It's pretty obvious that he wants to go to f3. Maybe can go to e2 in some lines, but obviously on f3 is a lot more strong. It's a lot stronger because by being on f3, this knight is controlling more squares in the center. A knight on e2, conversely, would not be able to control the e5 square. So for that reason, usually you already know that knight wants to go to f3 anyway, unless there's, again, a specific reason not to. Just play the knight there. And in terms of bishops, for example, this other knight kind of the same thing. You know, this knight usually wants to go to c3. Now, you may argue sometimes you want to bring the knight to c3 before you move these pawns or after you move this pawn. So that's something you can consider. But the idea is that this knight, again, it's not going to go here very likely. Just like this knight is not going to go to h3 very likely. And that means that you want to develop your knights first. And the bishops, usually, you want to develop bishops later. Now, if you want to castle first, it's absolutely fine to develop the f1 bishop before the b1 knight. But once again, you usually want to develop that after the f3 knight. And you may be seeing games where players play the bishop before the knight, and again, that's fine, they know what they're doing. But at this stage, focus on this simple development. Develop the knight before the bishop, because this bishop might want to go to c4, or maybe this bishop wants to go to b5. So for example, in this line, if black plays knight c6, hey, maybe you want to play bishop b5, putting pressure on the knight. But if black plays something different, there's no knight on b5, hey, maybe there's no point in putting a bishop on b5. So maybe you just want a bishop on c4. So just wait to see what black is doing, and then you'll develop that. This bishop sometimes might go to g2. This bishop sometimes might go to e2 or d3. So again, there's more options for this bishop, whereas for this knight, you pretty much know where the knight wants to go. So that's another important principle. And another principle I want to cover today as well is don't move your queen too early. A beginner's mistake is to start, going forward with the queen. Let's say, hey, I'm going to go to g4 so you can develop this bishop, because otherwise I'll take here. Hey, I can move this pawn, chasing your king, your queen away. Your queen's got to move. And let's say, for example, you play queen h5. Now, okay, there is a threat now. So black simply responds to the threat. And after something like bishop c4, again, you are attacking, and black needs to defend, but it's very easy to defend. Let's say g6, for example, and here you can go knight f6. In the future, you'll be able probably to play bishop g4, chasing the queen once again. So as you can see, black is getting all the development, and you are just wasting time with the queen. So ideally, you don't want to develop the queen too early. What you want to do is develop knights first, then the bishops, and then the queen. And the rooks are usually developed last, because rooks need open files. So right now, as soon as the game starts, there's no open files, of course. So there's no point in developing the rooks. But in the future, as soon as you castle, for example, you're going to be able to bring the rooks into the game. One more principle I want to cover today is don't move your don't move the same piece twice. And that's, again, a big mistake a lot of players make, especially beginners. Say, for example, you go knight f3, knight c6, and then they want to do something with this knight, and they move the knight again. Now, right now, okay, let's say they start with a move like bishop b5, for example, and then this knight f6 here. And I'm like, okay, my pawn is attacked in e4. I'm going to play knight g5, so I'm defending here, and my knight is more aggressive on g5, but in reality, it just doesn't work. This knight will be attacked eventually, will have to come back, and eventually you either lose material. Even if you don't lose material, what's going to happen is you're going to just waste a lot of time, because your opponent meanwhile is making useful moves that they probably want to make anyway, and you'll have to go back, and meanwhile you haven't developed the rest of your pieces. So this is also something you don't want to do. So let's just see, for example, what a sound opening looks like. So let's say e4, for example, e5, so you play knight f3. Again, you're moving the knight first, moving the knight only once, attacking the pawn, black defense, developing a knight, very natural as well. And then you can play bishop c4 or bishop b5. Let's say bishop b5, for example. Again, you're developing with a threat. And also, you're making space for your king to develop, to castle in particular. So black, let's say black defense like this, for example, is just one way to play, not the only way, of course. And then you can castle here, and all of a sudden, you've already achieved very harmonious development. And next, you will continue, for example, move like d3. Now, this pawn is defended. This bishop is coming into the game. This knight can come into the game via c3 or even d2 if you decide to play c3 to support a future d4. And then later on, the queen will come into the game, and the rooks will come as well. So just make a couple more moves. We are just assuming that the game might continue like this. Again, knight c3. Let's say black plays h6 to avoid problems on the g5 on g5, and you can develop the queen, for example, and just making some moves, and not necessarily the best move. So this is once again just to prove a point. All of a sudden now you have your rooks perfectly developed in the center. In the future, you will probably play d4 at some point, open up the center, and you can see that your pieces are definitely very well placed. So once again, this is just a demonstration where the pieces belong. I'm not talking about the move-by-move tactics here. It's more about, in general, understanding how to develop, what to develop first, and so on. So once again, this is possible, not necessarily only with e4. You can start with d4 as well. You can even start with c4, something, or knight f3. But in general, I suggest you stick to e4 or d4, especially if you're just starting out. And after d4 is very similar. Okay, you need one more tempo to develop the king side and castle as soon as possible. But after d4, d5, this pawn is very safe. You don't have to worry about that. You can develop, say, for example, knight f3 is a very normal move here. And black can play knight f6. Now, you could move this bishop now, or you could wait. Now, in general, this bishop is moved before this knight, because at some point, if you play e3, you're shutting down this diagonal. So it makes sense, again, I say develop the knights before the bishops, but sometimes you'll develop one knight first, and then one bishop, and then the other knight, and then the other bishop. The reason being, right now, if I ever want to move this bishop, And if I want to support this pawn, I have to play e3. So let me get this bishop out before I play e3. So that makes a lot of sense. And by the way, this opening is called the London system, and I do have a lot of material on the London system as well. So if you like this type of formation, if you would like to play this opening, definitely check out our other videos on the London system. And here, again, several moves are possible. Just make some moves to explain some basic strategy here. Again, you can develop the knight. You can develop the knight to d2, for example, which makes sense because if you want to play with a move like c3 or e3, you know, you're just not occupying the c3 square. But knight c3 is also possible. And then later on, okay, let's say black goes e6 to develop the other bishop. They can continue with e3, bishop d3, and castle short, and that is a perfectly playable game as well. So once again, we're not going too deep in this video, but we really want to show you the principle, like what to do and what not to do. You don't need to study, memorize a lot of openings if you're just starting. So if you're anything below 1000, you don't even need to know what openings are. Just follow this principle, it'll be fine. And if you're below 1500, I suggest you start studying some openings, but you study general ideas rather than memorizing long variations as well. Once you are 1600, then it makes sense to actually start learning longer variations. If you're over 2000, then you absolutely need to know the specific variations. Otherwise, it will be tough to play for a win, at least. You can still play for an equal game, especially if you're white, but playing for a win will become very, very hard. Now, if you're black, pretty much the same principles apply as well. It's just a tempo down. So but psychologically, that means that, hey, you don't have the pressure of creating an advantage from move one. You know, you play natural moves, you make sure that you don't blunder anything, you castle pretty quickly, you stay safe, you develop the pieces in the right order without moving the same piece twice, and you'll have a perfectly playable game with black as well. So just to recap real quick, in the opening, very important to castle as soon as possible, preferably kingside, although queenside castles is possible, in which case you usually want to bring the king to b1 as well, not just to c1, and then occupying the center. You know, if your opponent lets you occupy the center, just take it. You know, if after e4 your opponent doesn't challenge that and does something, I don't know, like a6, something useless, just, you know, occupy the center. Don't be afraid of that, of course, but usually your opponent will challenge you in the center. So in that case, develop your knights first, you then develop your bishops, and then again castle as soon as possible. You don't want to move your same piece twice, and you don't want to move the queen too early, because that means that the queen can be vulnerable and attacked by the minor pieces or the pawns of your opponent, and you will lose time. I'll give you a bonus tip. Another bonus tip is don't move too many pawns in the opening. The reason being, it might be tempting to grab a lot of space and just go all in and move all the pawns. But what you're doing every time you're moving a pawn is you're creating weaknesses. So it is necessary to move pawns, because if you look at the initial positions, hey, you're never going to develop this bishop if you don't move a pawn. So if you don't move pawns, you only play with the knights, really, which is not good. And so you have to move some pawns. But pawns, especially pawn moves, are not really development moves, or moves that make development possible. But once you have enough open lines to move your pieces, you really want to support your pawns with your pieces. So once again, if you start by just moving pawns and you are not really supporting these pawns, you just leave your pieces behind, then you'll create a lot of holes in your position, a lot of weaknesses, because pawns cannot move back. So if a pawn is too far advanced, there will be some squares that can no longer be controlled by that pawn, and therefore your position will become hard to defend. So I hope this video was useful. My name is Daniel Apria. If you enjoyed this content, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We have several videos for beginners to experts. And we have a live channel as well, twitch.tv/Daniel Apria. Make sure you check that out as well. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you in the next video.